7th and 8th grade. It is Harry Pedigo. How you guys doing? Hope you guys are having an awesome start to the week. I'm headed to the gym right now to catch a quick workout, pump some iron. Hope you guys are doing the same, staying healthy, staying active. Today you guys are going to be reading about Theodore Roosevelt and sort of what characterized his time as president. And I wanted to give you guys some supplementary information on this so you can better understand the material. And I think that the number one thing to know about what characterized Roosevelt's presidency was the idea of progressive reform, which you'll read about, but let's kind of break down what do we mean by progressive reform or progressivism as a whole. The best way to think about progressivism as far as our scope goes as 7th and 8th graders is to think about we're here right now in society and we want to be here. We want to enact change for the positive good of society, right? And you see that, to give you a couple examples, of progressive reform. One would be like the women's suffrage movement, where women were, they did not have the right to vote, and they progressed forward and were ultimately able to have that right. That's an example of a progressive reform. The progressive reforms that Roosevelt sort of enacted during his presidency were, one, really cleaning up industry. We talked about, Upton Sinclair in the book The Jungle, and how, these large-scale industries were really not clean, safe, or healthy, and were really kind of a danger, for people in the workplace, children, even adults. I mean, it was a nasty, dangerous place back then. And so we see some FDA emerges during this time to make sure that industries and businesses are being safe and healthy in their operations. So that's an example of a progressive reform. You start here, things are not the way we want them in business and industry, and we progress forward. We progress forward as we are now at this intersection. So that's an example of progressive reform. Another one that Theodore sort of helped bring about was the idea of conservation. And you probably have talked about this with Ms. Dragoo, conserving things, protecting things, especially natural resources. So when you see these national forests, you guys, I'm sure, have probably heard of national parks or forests, or probably a lot of you have actually been to some, but that's an example of conserving land. Roosevelt identified that we could easily, as a human, as humans and as Americans, use up sort of the resources in a particular area that make that area beautiful, whether it's mining, whether it's cutting down trees. And he said we need to have places that are preserved. And so that's where you see a lot of this national park movement, where you can't, mine or, cut down a bunch of trees or go and say, we're gonna get some caribou. The caribou industry is gonna be rocking. We're gonna kill them all. Like what happened to the buffalo, That's kind of silly, but he made that progressive reform. He said, this is where we're at now, where the environment is not being conserved, and we need to progress forward. And he was able to enact those changes. Another really cool person who was a proponent for this is John Muir. John Muir is an excellent writer and somebody who really promoted the conservation of natural resources and land in America. And he's an excellent poet, author. You will inevitably stumble upon quotes if you're like on Instagram, looking at some like outdoorsmen's or outdoorswomen's Instagram profile. They'll have like John Muir quotes and stuff like that. Really a neat author. You should look into John Muir. He's an example of somebody who was a progressive person, especially in how it relates to the environment. So progressivism in a nutshell. What I want you to think about, though, with progressivism, and this kind of relates to the current state of American politics and policy, but let's say that you and your friend both wanted to go somewhere. You both wanted to progress. You say, we're here right now in Ohio. Well, actually, I'm in Kentucky now. But we want to progress. We want to take a trip. We want to take a trip to Yellowstone National Park, right? But you guys both agree on where you want to progress, where you want to move forward to, but you can't agree on the way you're going to get there. Let's say you want to take a car, you want to do a little road trip across America, and your friend wants to take a plane. So you have conflicting views on how we should progress. And that's an example, kind of a silly illustration of how people can disagree about progressive reform in America. An example of that today would be like universal health care. Everybody can, I think, kind of agree that it's good for people, all people, to be healthy and have the opportunity for health and health insurance and health care. However, there are differing opinions on how we should actualize or make that happen. You know, Bernie Sanders, one of the people in the political climate of today, who's a big person, I'm sure you guys have heard of Bernie Sanders, advocates for universal health care that would be, get to a stop sign here, one sec. Universal health care that would also ultimately be like a social welfare program where it would be tax funded, right? And people kind of butt heads about that. I'm not saying one way or the other is right, but we both parties can have the same idea in mind, the health of American citizens, but disagree on the way to make that change happen. So you as a critical thinking young adult need to be aware that progressive reform is not as easy as it sounds, and it's not something that happens overnight because people disagree on the way progressive reform should happen. So think about that today, and think about how that relates to other things happening in the world around us, whether we want to progress from this place that's not where we want to be to a place that would be much better, and think about how people might have differing opinions on progressive reform. I'll catch you in a hot second. Actually, no, I got to get this workout in, but I'll be dropping back in to give you guys some insight on the Iliad and on some violin playing. Peace. 7th and 8th grade. Hope you guys are hanging in here. This is kind of part 2 of our video series. It's kind of nice outside. It's chilly, but it's very peaceful. Hope you guys get some time, make some time today to get outside. You got to stay active. You got to stay in touch with nature. So we're talking about book 6 of the Iliad, and I think that today I'm just going to try to give you guys a big picture of what's going on in this story. I mean, we'll get into some nitty-gritty bits tomorrow. But the big picture behind book 6 of the Iliad is comparing and contrasting different mentalities or ideas about what it is to be honorable or what it is to be a warrior. We're going to see that big time in the way that Agamemnon behaves very aggressively and calls for the deaths of all male Trojans, even the babies, stuff like that. It's very scary and kind of reminiscent of sort of what happened in the Bible when we think about the plagues that befell Egypt. Pretty serious. The killing of the firstborn male. And that's going to be contrasted with the way that these guys, these awesome heroes, Menelaus and Diomedes, act. They're going to be demonstrating some more humanity, some more kindness, and therefore some more honor in their behavior. Diomedes, in particular, is going to be rewarded kind of indirectly by being kind and being open to friendship and open to camaraderie, whether it's a Trojan or an Achaean. And we'll see, you'll catch on to that. I think we maybe mentioned that last week. You know, Diomedes getting this cool gold armor because he makes an agreement with one of the Trojan warriors. But the main point is that there is a conflict between good and evil, right and wrong. And sometimes those lines can be blurred, especially when you are a warrior, right? Sorry, I was making sure I was doing okay here. especially when you are on the battlefield and you've been there for 9+ years, right? What's the appropriate action, the appropriate behavior becomes confusing in times of crisis, right? And then we kind of see that now. What's the honorable way to act as people in the midst of a crisis? And I think that Diomedes and Menelaus help us answer that question. Agamemnon is an example of how not to act, right? So there's a contrast between what is appropriate, what's honorable, and what's dishonorable and inappropriate, right? You'll also see early on in book number 6 that there's a weird character who kind of pops up. Her name is like Helen Oates. And it's easy to, if you're, a young person reading this or even an adult, a lot of names being kicked around. But Helen Oates is a neat character. She's what we would call like a soothsayer, basically like a witch or a fortune teller. And she directs Hector to go and offer a sacrifice to Athena, and hopefully to kind of change the tide of the war. So we see again how much of a role the gods and goddesses and people who communicate with the gods and the goddesses like Helenos, how big of an impact they have. So that's where Hector's going to go. And Hector's going to kind of be removed from the battle for a little while. And the second comparison I'd like to make that's kind of interesting for us, we talked about how Agamemnon is kind of a dishonorable, at least in this case, sort of character, and Menelaus and Diomedes are more honorable. That informs us as like what's the right way to act in our current society. But the other comparison is between Hector and Achilles, and Achilles is not on the scene, and he won't be for a handful more books. But we see Hector kind of portrayed as sort of like a family man who is very interested. I think what we see at the end of book 6, Hector is truly invested in Troy, in the civilization. He's interested in the society that they've built there, and his intention. And he's also very invested in his family. But we see how that's contrasted his views of like, I'm fighting for family, for our society, and that will get me my honor. Now Achilles is an opposite. He's I'm fighting for myself and my personal honor. I'm fighting for Kleos, and it's self-centered versus society-centered, right? Achilles is the introverted fighter, and you could say that, I'm not sure if that's the right word, and Hector is the extroverted one. He is interested in his motivation. That's what I wanted to say. His motivation is protecting his family and society, and Achilles is protecting himself and gaining honor and protecting his honor once he has it, right? So think about that, and how that relates to our own lives. We could learn lessons from both of those people, Hector and Achilles. But that's a neat comparison and contrasting worldviews that we see in this. So what to remember is this book is about fighting, and it is about contrasting people's worldviews, right? Agamemnon versus Diomedes, and Achilles versus Hector. How their ideas can help inform us to be better people, and we can learn from them. So I will see you guys shortly with the violin lesson. Cheerio.